Bishop Mike. It's a real joy to be here with you today to share with you God's vision for a missional church. I understand that collegiate football can be a real passion and pretty important sport for many people. My son Ryan, who's now a Lutheran pastor near Madison, discovered that when he was on internship in Nebraska. One of your rivals. In fact, the first thing the congregation did was to give him a red hat and a red sweatshirt. One Saturday, when he was at the church office working on his sermon, one of his parishioners stopped by and chastised him for not having the football game on his radio. They wanted to know where his loyalty lay. So I'm pretty sure that there is just as much passion in this Synod for football, and I'm going to just engage you in a little friendly competition. And what I'd like you to do is just shout out when your team appears on the screen. And let me see how many fans are here from Arkansas for the Razorbacks. Whoa! Okay. And what about the Oklahoma Sooners? Now your bishop told me there might be some Cowboy fans. So, you guys are good. You're passionate. It's great to cheer on your teams. Well, would that we as a church would have as much passion for God's mission in the world. Football, as we know, is more than about just passion, however. It's about a singular mission. It's about strategy and how to get the ball down the field to score as many touchdowns or field goals as possible. And so it is with God's mission. I love your assembly theme. Jesus Walkers, living discipleship today. So I'd like to unpack that theme with you by first exploring what is a missional church. Now, many of you have a mission statement. I would guess maybe all of you have a mission statement for your congregation. However, the New Testament suggests that it is God who has a mission and congregations to help carry it out, which is sharing the good news for the sake of the world. A missional congregation, then, is one that seeks to partner in God's mission. The Missio Deo is God's missional plan. It involves the healing and redemption of the world. And we as a church, much like the players of a college football team, are the ones to carry the ball down the field and help make that happen. Two parts to God's missional strategy, like two sides of the same coin. And we've already heard about them in this assembly already. On the one hand, Jesus gave us the Great Commission and told us quite plainly, go into all the world and make disciples. And on the other hand, Jesus also reminded us of the Great Commandment, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. Or as Luther liked to say, to love your neighbor in need. We carry out God's missional plan as Jesus walkers in word and in deed. Our congregations are called then by God to be a community of disciples. The missional congregation understands it is primarily a missional community of people being trained and equipped to live among the world as daily disciples of Jesus. Its primary purpose is to carry out the gospel mission for the healing and redemption of the world. Let me share with you the story of a congregation that caught on fire, literally and figuratively, for God's mission. It was Trinity Lutheran Church in Seattle, Washington, where I was serving as a pastor, when in the summer of 1992, our campus was totally destroyed by an arson fire. We were one of the first victims of a 6-month arson spree. Churches, businesses, homes were burned. A wave of terror gripped the city as people wondered who would be the next victim. Many of the fires turned out to be the work of a serial arsonist by the name of Paul Keller, but there were also a number of copycat arsonists. Ours was a faith literally refined by fire. A faith that not only withstood the test of an arson fire, but that rose to the challenge of Christ's call to love and forgive those who sin against us. When Paul Keller was arrested and charged 6 months later with over 100 counts of arson, I went to see him in jail. I felt compelled by Christ to go. I thought of Jesus' words in the scriptures in Matthew where he says, "You've heard it said of old, love your friends and hate your enemies, but I tell you, love your enemies, that you might be sons and daughters of your Father in heaven." Well, when Paul saw me in that jail, he couldn't believe it. He said, "Pastor, I can't believe you've come, not after all the heartache I've caused you and your congregation and so many others." He said, "Since I've been in jail, I've had time to really think about what I've done. I've been reading my Bible and I've been praying. Pastor, do you think God can ever forgive me? Because I don't think I can ever forgive myself." And I reminded Paul that he was a baptized child of God, and that God looked at him through the cross of Jesus Christ, and that God still loved him and God still had a plan for his life. And then I told him that, while I didn't speak for the congregation, that I forgave him, and I would pray for him and for his family. His parents, as you can imagine, were devastated after all the heartache he had caused the community. And then Paul broke down and he wept. And he wept. Then he asked me if he could write a letter of apology, a letter which I read at worship the following Sunday. And Trinity's leadership responded in kind by writing a letter offering their forgiveness and prayer support for Paul and his family. After Paul was sentenced to life in prison, our congregation chose to become an instrument of healing and reconciliation in the community. We walked with Paul's family because they had been ostracized by their church. I became their pastor, and we became their faith community. We invited the victims of arson and the Keller family to come together for a service of prayer and healing, suggesting that now was the time to put the sorrow and the heartache and the anger and bitterness aside and to begin the process of healing and rebuilding our lives together. And this was a story that hit the national media. I was interviewed by CNN and Dateline and even appeared on the Oprah Winfrey Show. People were surprised and many moved by the response of forgiveness and grace. And yet there were others who were disturbed by it. One woman called me and she was very upset. She said, "Pastor, how can you forgive someone who burned down your church? What kind of a God do you believe in?" And I was pleased to tell her about the God that I had come to know in Jesus Christ. The God of forgiveness and grace. A God of second chances. A God who never gives up on us even when we give up on ourselves. But you know, like much of our culture, this woman would rather cling to bitterness and seek revenge. For the world doesn't understand much about this thing called grace and forgiveness. However, we can never overestimate the power of forgiveness to change and transform lives. It even changed our faith community. For through that tragedy, our congregation was given new life and a renewed sense of purpose. We sought to be an agent of God's healing love in our community and in our world. We crafted a new vision statement: healing hurts, renewing hope, rebuilding lives. Healing hurts, renewing hope, rebuilding lives. Trinity embraced God's new vision for its ministry and built a new campus that today serves as both a worship and community center where more than 1,000 people a day come through its doors. Before we built our new campus, however, we had to set aside our preconceived notions and our personal agendas and ask some new questions to help us guide our process of rebuilding. The changing questions might be some for you to think about with your own congregation. What is God's vision for our promised future? Where is God leading us now in this time and place to serve? How can we partner with God in God's mission in the world? These were questions that guided our plans, our sense of mission, our vision for who we were to be as a congregation in that place. Many of us have seen these statistics. Congregations in this country have been in serious decline for 40 years. The ELCA congregations, while not as in steep decline as some, have followed the pattern of many mainline denominations. Consider the fact that based on worship attendance, only 18% of our congregations are growing, meaning that they, over a 10-year period, they have grown by about 3% or more in worship. Whereas another 14% are just maintaining. They haven't grown by more than 3%, but they haven't lost more than 3% either. Just kind of hanging in there. 68% of our congregations are in decline, meaning that the worship attendance continues to go down. Maintaining simply means a congregation is hanging in there. 82% of our congregations are just hanging in there, either maintaining or in decline. This next slide from the ELCA Office of Research may be hard to read. If you look at the red line, the third from the bottom, it shows the ELCA compared with some other denominations, losing about 1 million members between 2000 and 2011. The next slide shows how average worship has shifted over that same period. In 1990, the average worship attendance was 148. Here's a slide. It was 148, but it has slipped now in 2013 to 114. From 148 to an average of 114, and continues to slide. That's the average worship attendance of our ELCA congregations. What I think is of interest is the 2010 American Religious Identification Survey, which is done about every 10 years and is even more telling. If you look at the none category, those are people that say they are not affiliated with any religious organization. They check none, none of the other. And that has doubled in a 20-year period from 8 to 16% to 2010, and that continues to grow rapidly, which we'll see in a moment. Interestingly enough, the state of Oregon in the Northwest was considered to be the most unchurched state in the Union. But now that honor has shifted to Vermont, where over a third of the people in that state claim to have no religious affiliation. Overall, mainline Protestants are down to less than 13% of the population, suffering almost a 6% loss. Roman Catholics have about flatlined. Non-denominational churches report a slight loss of less than 1% and are now at about 14% of the population. Interestingly enough, both Pentecostal and Mormon are statistically flatlined with no gain or losses. Finally, the last of these slides emphasizes the fact that the none category now far eclipses all other religious groups in the U.S. except the Roman Catholic Church. In her book, Belief Without Borders, Linda Mercandante reports that there are now more nuns in America than all the Protestants put together. She cites statistics that between 1990 and 2000, the number doubled from 14 to 29 million, and by 2010, we were at 46 million unaffiliated, or 1/5 of all Americans with no religious affiliation. Talk about a mission field. We'll talk more about the implications of this in my next presentation tomorrow morning. Right now, I want to encourage some table conversation, and you can just kind of turn to a couple of people near you. And I have a few questions that I'm going to encourage you to think about. You don't have to answer them all. We have about 10 minutes to talk together. You can pick one or two of the questions. The first one is the ELCA facing a time of crisis or opportunity? Second, what are the lessons from Trinity Lutheran in the Seattle area, and how did they move forward after a devastating fire? And finally, what are new opportunities that God may be opening up for your congregation? Let's take 10 minutes for some conversation.